So when we're looking at the locos that we want to make for the routes, one of the things we really want to look at is what adds to the variety, what adds to the types of gameplay, what's iconic on that route, what's important to the experience and the range of things that you see. So whether you're someone who's walked around on the stations, you've commuted on the route, what trains do you see on that route? What would be odd if it was missing from that route? Um, but then there's also what does different things, whether they're shunting trains or high-speed trains or regional trains. And it's really about looking at all of those different things to try and make sure that we've got a nice broad experience, and we try and do as much as we can to capture the range of stock that is on a route. When we're recreating locomotives, coaches, wagons into Train Sim World, we don't do scanning or anything like that. It's not necessarily always practical. What we do is take a lot of photographs, or find a lot of photographs. We want to get all of those photographs, which strangely very few people take. It's what does it look like on the dirty bit on the top of the train where all of the smoke has been exhausted? What does it look like in the grimy bit under the train where the wheels are and the brakes are and so forth? The pretty bit on the side with the colour and the logo is important, but everyone takes pictures of that. So that's really generally on the much easier side to find, is getting all those details, and those details on the top and the bottom, so where the pantographs are on the top of an electric train, or on the traction motors and so forth on the underside. They're really important because even though there's no there's a lot less photographs of them, the enthusiasts know what they look like. It's really important to capture that. So we take possibly thousands of photographs, hundreds or thousands of photographs when we go and do a photo survey.
We will survey them, we will climb all over them, we will make a nuisance of ourselves, and we will get very dirty knees climbing underneath trains, and we come back with thousands upon thousands of images, hours of videos. We take 360-degree video and photography, everything we can possibly get, that when I come back with and give to someone else to produce this, it's as if they were able to go out themselves and they could see it for themselves. We leave no stone unturned. We worked with Caltrain. Myself and one of our audio engineers flew out to San Francisco for a week. Very hard work, and we spent the week surveying anything we could get our hands on. So we surveyed the F40 PHs, the 2Cs, the 2CATs, the Bombardier stuff, the Nippon Chariot coaches, and a few other bits and bobs. We took them up on their hospitality and their generosity of their time. They made as much time for us as possible. They gave us all the answers to the questions we had. We walked away with more information than we thought we would. It was invaluable in being able to accurately recreate these things.
Our local art team then take all of these materials along with any scale drawings they're able to find, and any really nice photographs which gives them nice side-on shots they haven't been able to get themselves, and they can then recreate that using their artistic skill essentially. Yeah, it's an amazing process to watch, going from these photographs to seeing this locomotive being built and then in 3D and then looking amazing in GSW.
So in the past, we've had quite a bit through from operators. It can vary from operator to operator what they're comfortable with providing. But for example, with the recently developed Marseille to Avignon route, we were scheduled to have a full survey in Paris of the duplex sets, which unfortunately we had to cancel. However, we had a very cooperative partner with SNCF. They were able to send us so much documentation. We had branding documents to go over the colors of the liveries, the positioning of various livery details. We got extensive engineering drawings for the duplex, for the carriages, that were invaluable because we weren't able to go and get these ourselves. And we knew we could model these with these drawings to close to millimeter perfection. I mean, very close, very high level of accuracy, probably higher than most that we're able to achieve, because it can be very difficult to get engineering drawings. They're generally not something that the train operating companies themselves hold. So SNCF were incredibly helpful in us ensuring we were able to put something out there that was the real deal, or as close as you can get.
The greatest thing that train operators do for us is they give us access often to the technical manuals that describe how the trains are driven, and how they're meant to be, treated by the driver effectively. And often these technical manuals are a real wealth of information. They say, well, when you push this button, what happens exactly? And we can use that really, really directly in building up our simulations. It's very helpful to be able to say, well, you know, it's difficult if you're looking at a picture of a cab and you're trying to work out, well, what does this button do? The only thing that really tells you is the locomotive driver's manual. And in situations where we get that, that's fantastic. It would be very difficult for us to build a train without access to that kind of information from train operators.
We like to work with drivers and other staff from the railways as much as possible, because nobody knows how these trains work, how the route works, and how the operations work better than the people who do it. And so, for example, on Southeastern High Speed, we were able to get anecdotal conversations and information from drivers about, this is how the train feels to drive when I accelerate it like this, when it decelerates like this. This is the kinds of experiences we have. How dark is it in the tunnels on the high speed section? Do you see some tunnels, when you see them recreated or see cab ride videos on YouTube, they're light? Have they got lights in these tunnels? And how dark is it? And the answer is, it's pitch black in those tunnels. And you don't know that unless you actually talk to a driver. What do the buttons and switches do? What are the important buttons and switches do? How does the sound react when you move this lever? Does the engine make these whining noises? Oh, that's because I moved it in this way. See, as a person who rides the trains or records the trains, with my phone as they go past, I know what a train sounds like, but I don't know why it sounds like that. Whereas someone who drives the trains can say, oh yeah, whenever we come into that station, we always do this with the brake lever, and that's why you hear it sound like that. If we didn't do that, it wouldn't sound like that. So those kinds of bits of information and advice really help us to hone down on what's important to the end user experience, but also recreate as authentically as possible and capture the experience of being in and around those trains.
The people who help us gather reference and help us with our queries go into a great amount of detail. We, for example, recently finished developing the Class 395 for the Southeastern route. Now, this was something we were going to go and survey until the world said no. And so we had to rely on our previous surveys for Train Simulator, which at this point are about 8 or 9 years out of date. So one of the great things that our contacts in the community were able to help us with were saying, oh, yes, 90% of what you've done is correct. But in the 8 or 9 years since you went and surveyed these, they have added elements. So the cabs have new labels, and we have covers on switches that we don't want our drivers touching. And it's all these sort of things that we would not have known otherwise. We'd have no means to. We can't go out and get these pictures right now. And so some of our reference, as good as it is frozen in time, and it may not be representative of what we want to be presenting in the game. So it's just these tiny things that you wouldn't give a second thought to. They take a look at and go, yep, you're almost there. You just need this extra little push and you'll have it.
One of the interesting things we've learned through talking to the staff that help us is that a lot of them play the game already, and they're really interested. And it's amazing when you think that they do this job all day. That's what they do for their living. They come home and they play more trains. And it's because a lot of people that work on the railways are passionate about railways, and that's exactly what Train Sim World is all about. And a lot of our beta testers are drivers, and they literally will spend all day driving and come home and spend all night driving, and they love it. And it's absolutely a really good validation of what we get right, and they tell us what we get wrong. And how we can improve it, and that's brilliant, and I love hearing that. But it's really good having that validation that if they didn't like it, they wouldn't play it. When you're making the locos, there's a few things which really have to be accurate as possible. One of them is the shape. Most trains, even if to the untrained eye you can't see the difference between train A and train B, that's actually where it becomes much more important to actually have caught those differences. This one has an extra vent, this one has its headlights in a slightly different place. That's where it becomes really important. So the detail, the overall shape, where it's an F7, for example, on Clinchfield, which has got a really unique shape to it, or whether it's a C40-8W in America, which looks like so many other American trains to the untrained eye, but actually is, if you know your eggs, then it's absolutely unique. You can tell it apart. So we have to understand and capture all of those things.
I want to get the proportions right immediately. We want to get it looking correct. One of the things I've seen over the years is if you focus too much in on the detail to start with, you will get the details right, but nothing will look right because nothing quite sits where it should do in relation to one another. So getting the broad stroke, is it the right width? Is it the right height? Are the doors offset in the right place? Are the bogies where they need to be? All these things, get it right on day one, or maybe not day one, but get it right as early as possible and then start to focus in on the detail. It's what people notice. The details you zoom in on, but when you post that first screenshot of a train on Facebook or Twitter or wherever it may be, and you've got a window too far to the left, it doesn't matter how shiny it is because that's what people notice. They know what these trains look like. And even if they can't notice it, they will notice something doesn't look right. And I don't want people doing that with our stuff. I want people to be impressed with what we're showing them. And so getting those proportions right is the first step. Got to get that. One of the challenges that I face, especially being involved with recruitment for our team, is actually finding artists with the right stuff. With the aforementioned eye for detail, it's not difficult to find an artist who can make a pretty portfolio piece, but then to take that and to introduce it into our world that is very technical, it is very detail oriented, it's very specific, that can be quite the challenge. And we have a very strong team of artists here. We have about 4 or 5 guys here of varying different lengths of service with Dovetail, and none of them start off as the sort of fully formed package, but as they work on locomotives, on wagons, on coaches, they start to learn, and whether they want to or not, they become train fans out of necessity. They need to know trains. They need to understand that box does this lever does that. You can take a lever from here and it will work the same as that one over there. And over time, they build up this knowledge base that they probably didn't anticipate needing when they started working for us. But it happens to them all. They all become appreciative of trains in some form or another. And it's quite interesting to watch. You see people come in and they wouldn't even be able to tell you what train they took to the interview on day one. A year in, they'll be able to tell you more than they probably feel comfortable knowing.
In addition to the look of the train, there's then how is it going to feel to drive? Well, how is it going to sound?
Audio is important because it helps the player familiarize themselves with their surroundings. It gives them feedback as to what is happening and what is about to happen. So if you think of things like train alerters signaling and going off, without audio there, it could probably be perceived as a bug. You know, the train's just screeching to a halt and there's nothing to indicate to you why that's happening.
Even if you've never driven these things, you'll have been around them. You can see videos of them. What are the iconic sounds that these things make? Whether they are something like the BL182, for example, which has a really unique musical sequence of notes as it starts accelerating because of the way the motors are set up, or the Class 465 on Southeastern High Speed, which has the older style of traction motors on there. So we've got to pick those things and get those in correctly. And then the third thing is the behavior of it, how fast it accelerates, how fast it slows down, and how it responds to driving. So those really, how it looks, how it sounds, and how it drives are sort of the 3 pillars that we build everything off. So there's a number of different ways that we can obtain the audio for trains. by far the best option is recording it directly from the train itself, which sometimes comes up as an option that we can take on, sometimes doesn't, because train operators have got busy jobs. They've got trains to run, and sometimes the train that we want to record isn't available for us to strap microphones to or something like that. So we have to work with the operators. And in one case, for example, in Caltrain's case, when we went out to California, they were fantastic, and we were able to strap microphones onto all of the cab cars, the locomotives that we wanted, which is the F40 and the MB36, and record all of the sounds. A huge library of audio we recorded from that. Horns blowing, bells going, and inside the cab, just standing holding microphones and recording all the clicks and switches and knobs moving and the levers squeaking away. Windows creaking up and down, all sorts of strange things there. And that's all audio which you would then capture and put to one side, which you then use for in the game. But then you've also got reference audio, which is just a microphone somewhere so that we can hear how all this sort of stuff fits together. What is the general ambience of being in a cab at 40 miles an hour with the window open versus the window closed? How is that? How does it rattle? Or how is it actually really quiet in the cab? Is it really noisy? So we try and get all of those things, and then we can put them into the game.
So to ensure we give the game sounds an authentic feel and don't become stale, we have to record multiple takes of every individual thing, so we can kind of draw on them from random, so we're getting variations. If you were to listen to sounds like a dog barking, it doesn't bark identically every time. It might do a burst of 2 or 3 barks and then a 10-second pause and then a long one-shot bark. So you kind of need to be able to add variations to your sounds whilst keeping your memory footprint in relatively small. So we use systems to tweak pitch, tweak volume, based on what the player is doing. The sound of the engine is controlled by the things like the rotations per minute. So we need to be able to adjust the sounds we actually have recorded based on the values the simulation is giving. Otherwise, the sound of your traction motor wouldn't pitch up nicely and give you, that accelerating sound. It would just sit stagnant and get really, boring and stale if we weren't communicating with the SimiGraph technology.
SimiGraph is an amazing system which lets us replicate or simulate a lot of the really complex innards of what goes on actually, from the levers and dials that you see on the cab to the wheels on the ground. So what happens when you move the brake lever? What happens when you press this button or move the throttle lever? What are the actions that end up in something changing on the train, the brakes releasing or the train moving? And so all of this system is then simulated inside SimiGraph.
It's really the keystone of what Train Sim World does. For us, what it provides is a simulation of all these different domains that build up the way that the train works: the pneumatic domain, the mechanical domain, the electrical domain, the logical domain, and it does that in real time. So for each of these domains, say the pneumatic domain, we're talking about the valves and the cylinders and the reservoirs and the compressor that build up the air brake system of a modern locomotive, and we can use that in basically any number of combinations. We can build these systems out of their component parts. So like a valve, in the electrical domain, it's a switch or a motor or a generator, and we can build these out in infinite number of ways to represent what the real world locomotive is all about and how it functions.
It looks ultimately like a big circuit diagram of all these different systems which manage mechanical and electrical and pneumatic systems, and how they combine together to each other. And then some of those go out onto the cab and are manifested into gauges or inputted from levers. Some of them, that the traction motors, would then influence the physics of the train, which would make it maybe go or slow down. So, but SimiGraph manages effectively how the train goes and how it stops.
SimiGraph allows us to take quite a high level overview of what makes a train tick, what makes a locomotive tick. And that's kind of like a block diagram. It's a layout of what valves are where and how the powertrain is connected up, how the generator is connected to the motors, or the transformer is connected to the motors, and really build it out in a very intuitive way. It lets us put these systems into operation working together, so we can have the air system and the power system really in finely tuned balance working together. So when you have a locomotive where the power and brake controller is one physical lever in the cab, in SimiGraph we are representing it the same way. We take in one lever input and we make the braking and the power come naturally from that one kind of physical control. And that's a very elegant way of building out these things. You don't have to kind of split them up logically at any point. SimiGraph can just handle it.
The BR112, as an example, is it's driven with cruise control. So you don't really have a normal throttle lever in there. So what you're doing as a driver is you're saying, set your target speed to 30 kilometers an hour. So my input into the system is just to set the target speed. And then what happens internally is it works out how much power does it need to do that, and then it will start not tapping up internally. So it's not even on a normal modern electric. You've got a slidey control from 0 to 100%. It works the way you'd expect it to. But on these slightly older electrics, they've got what they call taps or notches, and there's usually about 30 of them. And essentially, it just taps up one, which applies one bit of power. If it needs more power, it taps up again. So you can hear all this. You see all these fixed notches being applied up, and then and the audio then captures that, because you can hear that in the back room behind you. You can hear it going click 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 as it going up the range. And once it starts getting to the speed it needs to, and it needs to then start tapping back down, and click 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 as it then taps back down again. And so SimiGraph components in there are managing a lot of what's going on with managing that speed. So you just had one input, but there's this whole logic going on inside to actually get to that speed, manage the cruise control side of it, and also manage the how it delivers the power to the wheels to get there.
The way in which the audio is triggered within Train Sim World is very much in tandem with the SimiGraph technology. The diesel engine sounds are triggered and manipulated further by the values output by the SimiGraph. So if the SimiGraph is saying the engine is putting out 500 RPMs, we have to adjust the sound files we have based on that information and try to match the pitch that it would output. And similarly with traction motors, you're matching voltage and watts output to the sound and trying to match it that way. So when the player adjusts the lever, the traction lever on the locomotive, that's telling the SimiGraph to apply more voltage, more power, which then tells the audio to increase or decrease in volume and pitch.
My favorite SimiGraph is the Class 166 from Great Western Express. It's a fantastic loco with a lot of character, but the reason I think it's the best is the way that the train behaves. When you start off from a station, the engine revs up dramatically and then it settles down as the whole powertrain comes into motion all at once. And you get that characteristic kind of rev up and rev down. That's not something that we had to program in by hand. That's something that happens as a result of the way the SimiGraph components interact. As the torque converter fills, the engine load increases and the speed and the RPM decreases. And that's a really beautiful display of what SimiGraph is capable of. The most engaging part of the Loco setup process is definitely the first moment that you get the whole SimiGraph in place and you press go for the first time and see what the results are. Quite exciting to see something having gone from no simulation at all, just a locomotive sitting on some tracks, to it rolling into motion. And often then you immediately discover some sort of problem. You discover that you've given it power but no brakes, and the train runs away from you. And you go, well, that's the learning process.
When we were trying to do gameplay for a particular train, it's really about understanding what that train does and how it does it, and what it would do throughout its day. So, for example, a passenger train is probably going to be just running up and down the line, but it's probably not just going to be doing that. At some point, it's probably going to be going into a depot, whether it's the start and the end of the day. Some trains will not be part of the normal run during the quiet hours. They're only there brought in for the peak hours, and so they'll disappear off after the peak hour in the morning, and then they'll come back in peak hour in the afternoon, and they'll run that. Some trains on the Long Island, for example, they'll go and do a run from point A to point B. When they get from there, they'll go do a completely different run, and then do a completely different run. So they actually don't do A, B, A, B. They just do A, B, C, A, B, C. They're all over the place. And the reason for that makes sense in that if one train was to fail in real life, they don't lose a massive amount of one's particular service. They lose a little bit of a broad range of services. So it's trying to understand the reasoning behind and what these trains do. Freight trains, it can be even more challenging. So on the Clinchfield Railroad, there is no timetable to speak of, really, because freight moves when it needs to move. There are regularly scheduled trains, like the Train 97, which is the Florida Perishables run, which runs refrigerated cars northbound. But then like the Greenbrier turn or the Nora turn that service the coal mines on the route, they kind of run when they need to. And it's, well, what does it do? How does it do it? How does the train move around the route? I've got 4 locomotives on the front and 40 wagons on the back and a caboose behind that. How does that work when I've got sidings not facing in the way that I think I need them to be? How do I do those moves? And so reading, what we'll do there is, in the case of Clinchfield, we spend a lot of time reading accounts from engineers, from historical documentation, from magazine articles, and from articles we found on the web. It's just, well, how does this work? What did the engineers of these trains do, and how did these things get operated? So then we'd start working out and piece together the puzzle of how these things actually work, how the locomotive does what it needs to do. We want to give you realistic things to do, so that again, take the Clinchfield example. It can be 8 hours to do one engineer's turn on the Greenbrier, for example. So you could pick to do a little bit of that. Or if you just want to be completely immersed and do exactly what the Greenbrier or one of the Clinchfield engineers do, you can pick to do that from start to finish, and just live that life, essentially. We want to keep you in the world, so you can, when you finish your journey, you get to Aschaffenburg on the main Spessartbahn, you can get out of the cab and and walk around the platform, see the next train that arrives heading eastbound, and wander over to that platform, take that train over, and off you go. So you can role play to some extent what your day as a driver is.
My favorite part of the process would have to be the culmination at the end, seeing our trains working, seeing all of our models responding to player input, hearing the audio that is tied with that. It starts to come alive. For the first 75% or so of our art production, these are just polygons. They're just polygons with textures on, and they look like trains, but they're dead objects. It's when all the teams start to click and everything starts to behave like a train. That's where I like to see it. I like to see it pretty much at the finish line, where you can see the culmination of everyone's hard work, and it's no longer a bunch of polygons running along some more polygons with some audio triggers. It starts to become something comparable to real life.